Genesis 31, Jacob and his family finally depart from Haran after 20 years. He came by himself when he arrived, but now he's leaving with a lot of folks. 4 wives, 12 children, and maidservants, manservants, a lot of cattle, and so on. And he's headed back to Canaan. So we have, first of all, the departure, verses 1 to 21. And then the pursuit. Laban's not happy when he finds out Jacob is gone. Verses 22 to 25. And then the conflict, the back and forth between Laban and Jacob, verses 26 to 42. And then it ends up with a covenant between them in verses 43 to 55. So let's begin with the first 3 verses. And he heard the words of Laban's sons, talking about Jacob, heard what Laban's sons were saying about him. Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. I'm not sure they're so worried about their father as much as they are that's their inheritance. I'm sure they're thinking mostly about themselves. Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. It reminds me of Cain. It says in Genesis 4 that because he was wroth, his countenance was fallen. So Laban's so upset, you can see it on his face. And the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I'll be with thee. You know, Jacob had already tried to go home, but it was Laban that selfishly pleaded with him to tarry so that he could continue to prosper. Remember back in chapter 30, verse 25, came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go unto mine own place and my country. Give me my wives and my children from whom I've served thee. Let me go. For thou knowest my service which I have done thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry. For I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me. That's what it's about. As long as you're here, Jacob, I'm well off. I'm more wealthy with you around. He's blessed me for thy sake. And so Jacob had stayed on for a while, but now it's definitely time to go. Things didn't work out as Laban hoped, because during that time, it was Jacob who increased in prosperity while he was decreasing. And so Jacob heard that Laban's sons were accusing him of taking away their father's wealth. And notice it says, that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. The glory there is referring to his prosperity. For example, over in Psalm 49, verse 16, be not thou afraid when one is made rich, when the glory of his house is increased. For when he dieth, he shall carry nothing away. People say, I wonder how much that rich man left when he died. Well, he left it all. He can't take nothing with you. When he dieth, he shall carry nothing away. His glory shall not descend after him. The glory of a man, just material things, that fades away. God's glory is eternal. We ought to live for the glory of God. But Laban's sons, I don't know how many he has, at least 2, because it's plural. I don't know for sure how many, but they were envious. And in their envy and bitterness against Jacob, they conveniently overlooked the fact that it was because of Jacob that their father had gained the wealth that he did. And not only that, they were overlooking the fact that it was their father who had mistreated Jacob far more than Jacob mistreating Laban. And but Jacob noticed a difference in the way Laban was looking at him. He said, I better get out of here while I can. It's only a matter of time before they're going to come against me. And so while he was thinking on those things, the Lord told him, go home. I mean, that's the plain message from the Lord. In verse 3, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I'll be with thee. See, it was God's will for the patriarchs to sojourn in the land of promise, and Jacob has been outside the land. He needs to go back. God's saying, do what I tell you, and I'll be with you. All right, verse 4. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field and to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it's not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me. And you know that with all my power I've served your father. And your father hath deceived me, and changed my wages 10 times. But God suffered him not to hurt me. In other words, he's saying, I'm well off in spite of your father, not because of him. If he said thus, and this goes back to the whole deal with how Jacob got much of the cattle and how all that worked out, that whole scheme there with the speckled and the ring string. I'm not going to go back all over that. We talked about that last time, but he's referring back to this. If he had said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he had said thus, the ring strake shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ring strake. He said no matter what he would have said was the condition, I was going to come out on top, and here's why. Verse 9, thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. So this is very manipulative, what Jacob's doing here. It's kind of hard to argue with someone when they're saying, well, God said this and God did this. And I think he's kind of embellishing this somewhat. And it came to pass, verse 10, at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. He's saying, in a dream I saw that God was making sure that he was going to get what was born under his care, and it was supposed to be, he said, I'll take the more uncommon looking, but it ended up being, that's mainly what was born under his care. And he's saying God caused this to happen. That's what the point he's trying to make. And verse 11, the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob, and I said, Here am I. And he said, Lift up now thine eyes and see. All the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. It has to do with the markings on them. Ring-strake is like bands of color around their body. Speckled and grizzled, that's obvious. Again, the way these things have these markings. I've seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. So Jacob knew it would be an advantage if Rachel and Leah wanted to leave with him. I mean, if you're going on a long trip and your wives don't want to go, I mean, bad enough if your wife doesn't want to go, but if all your wives don't want to go, you're going to have trouble. So he's trying to work it out and make sure they want to go. And leaving home, they've never been anywhere else. That's a tough thing. So he called them out to the field for a private meeting. And in his pious speech, he played the victim. And look, Laban did him wrong, but Jacob also did Laban wrong, right? He played the victim, sought to turn them against their father. And his whole goal was to make it easy for them to want to leave. And there is some truth in what he said. I get that. But he never acknowledges any wrongdoing on his part. And he didn't tell him about his cattle scheme and the practice of selective breeding. I mean, he did certain things to make it turn out a certain way. Now, I do believe God blessed despite what he was doing. But he didn't tell him what he had been doing. He just said, hey, God gave me all this. And I think Jacob's embellishing the account a little bit, even of the dream. I mean, God just said in verse 3, return in the land of thy fathers and thy kindred, and I'll be with you. That's what God told him. But he has God to tell him, man, Jacob, I'm blessing you. I'm against Laban. I'm giving you Laban's cattle. And he's got him saying all this stuff that I'm not so sure if it's not an exaggeration. Jacob's trying to make himself look good. Look, one of the things that throws a red flag to me in verse number 13, where God supposedly brings up this vow Jacob made. I don't think God cared about the vow. I think Jacob's vow was dishonoring to God. God made promises to Jacob, remember, at Bethel. And Jacob said, now if you keep your promises, then I'll serve you. I don't think God was impressed with that at all. So I think this is Jacob embellishing, exaggerating, and trying to make himself out to look as good as possible in the eyes of his wives, to manipulate them to follow him. And it worked. Verse 14. Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? Evidently, he didn't have much of a relationship with him. For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours, and our children's. Now then, all right, last point. Whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. So his manipulative speech worked, and Rachel and Leah were on board with his plans, and their primary concern was that since Jacob had the wealth, that's where they wanted to be. In other words, they're saying if we stay here, we don't have much of an inheritance. I mean, our husband has a lot of prosperity. Let's go with him. And also, they had some bitterness. They felt their father had treated them like strangers, especially when he made the deal with Jacob. He got 14 years of labor out of Jacob for his two daughters. The implication is he didn't ask them how they felt about it. Obviously, they went along with it, but I mean, they're kind of upset with their dad about this whole thing. And lastly, they made the point that Jacob should do what God told him to do. That's the last point they made. And that's the best advice a wife could ever give her husband. You know, hey, whatever God said, let's do that. That's when definitely a man should listen to his wife whenever she says, let's do whatever God said, right? Abraham got in trouble when his wife said, let's do things our way instead of trusting God. And Rachel and Leah had been wrong in some scheming themselves in that whole baby contest we saw last time. And so, but now they're saying, okay, let's do what God said. But I'm not that impressed because, again, that was their last point. Their own wealth, not God's will, was their primary concern. Verse 17. And then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padanaram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. And Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. And Jacob stole away unawares. He snuck out of town. He did it secretly to Laban the Syrian. It's kind of hard to sneak out with that many people, but he snuck out as far as he was waiting for Laban to be away from home when he left. And that he told him not that he'd fled. So he fled with all that he had. He rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. And so Laban's away shearing sheep, and he's 3 days away, because it took 3 days to get the word back to him that Jacob had left. And Jacob secretly fled with his family, his goods, his cow, took everything. And it was unawares to Laban because, you know, Jacob knew that Laban thought that wealth belonged to him, and he would try to prevent him from leaving. And Laban's concern, now Laban later is going to act like his primary concern was his family, but I doubt that very seriously. I mean, he sold his two daughters for labor. And I don't think he was that concerned about them. They said, we're like strangers to our dad. Now, I think he was more concerned about that money is what he was really concerned about. And Jacob knew it would be that way. And so, once again, Jacob's scheming more than trusting. God said, return home and I'll be with you. Jacob said, I better make a plan here to get out of here safely. Well, why not just be honest and do the right thing and say, Laban, you know, I'm sick and tired of your deception and it's time for me to go home. I'll catch you later. Just be upfront and honest and trust God to protect you. But he didn't want to do that. He was trying to, manipulate the situation. He didn't know it, but his favorite wife stole her father's idolatrous images and took them with her. The images here are little statues. They're idols. They're gods. Look in verse 30. Laban asked Jacob at the end of the verse, wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? Well, she stole images. Those images were images of gods. They were pagan statues. She probably thought the pagan charms would give them a prosperous journey. I don't know what all she was thinking, but her heart's not right with God if she wants these things. And some said, I read one commentator said, well, she thought that Laban would know what way they went if he inquired of his gods, and that's why she took them. I don't know what's going through her head, but these things are dead, dumb idols. And she's taken them. And this is the first mention of images in the King James Bible. And there's a whole study of this we're not going to get into right now. You know, we're going verse by verse. I'm not going to do a breakout study on images, but you can get a concordance or go on eSword or whatever it is you use and just run the references. They varied in size from large to small, and these were obviously small if she can pack them away in her luggage. But, they said these are aids of worship. And these little statues, it's like a little St. Christopher. She said, we better put this statue of St. Christopher on our camel so we'll have a safe journey. Catholics have St. Christopher on their dash or whatever. They still do that. Someone said they don't anymore because there were so many Catholics getting in wrecks. They fired St. Christopher, who's supposed to protect them on their journey. And they got a saint for everything, Saint this and saint that and saint the other. Well, if you're saved today, you're a saint because you're sanctified in Christ. The Catholic saints is just a bunch of junk. But the Word of God condemns the use of images in worship. But the Roman Catholic Church ignores that, just like they ignore a lot of what the Scripture says, and they prefer their own traditions. Do you know in the Ten Commandments, the second one is not to make any graven image? They delete that from the Ten Commandments in their Catholic Bible. And the way they get around that is they make the 10th commandment 2. They make 2 out of the 10th, and they replace the second because they try to get that graven image commandment out of there. Why? Have you ever walked into a Catholic so-called church? That's all there is in there is graven images. And so it's a pagan religion pretending to be Christian. That's all it is. And so here's the thing about Jacob, though. He'd been there 20 years. His father-in-law's an idolater. His wife is interested in stealing his gods. What are you doing, Jacob? What kind of influence? I mean, evidently he didn't influence them away from idolatry, and he knows. Jacob knows idolatry is wrong. He knows who the true and living God is, but he wasn't much of a testimony while he was there. Verse number 22. And it was told Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob was fled. So again, Laban was 3 days away shearing sheep. And so as soon as Jacob left, one of his workers came to tell him, but it took him 3 days to get there. And he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said to him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the same Mount Gilead. And so Laban, he didn't know, again, till the 3rd day, and the 3rd day, that's a very significant thing in the Bible, and I don't know for sure if there's much significance to it here. It could just be it was the 3rd day, period. I don't know if there's a typology in this or not. But anyway, he didn't know until the 3rd day that he was gone. And then whenever he found out, he immediately rounded up a posse and got a bunch of his brethren together. And they said, ha! And they got on their camels and took off out of there. What is it about a posse? You ever rounded up a posse? You always got, let's go, I guess that's how you round a posse up anyway. That's one of my favorites on Andy Griffith when Barney tried to get a posse together to help Andy. And it was like, Otis and Floyd. And he's like, Funny stuff. But anyway. So they lighted out of there. They took off and went after him. And they were able to travel faster. They didn't have women, children, and a bunch of livestock and all that. So they caught up with them. Took 7 days. But, again, Jacob had a big head start. When he finally caught up to him in Mount Gilead, Mount Gilead's on the east side, the northern end of the Jordan River. It's the area southeast of the Sea of Galilee. When he finally caught up, the night before that he was going to meet with Jacob and talk to him, God came to Laban in a dream and warned him not to mess with Jacob. God's basically saying, Laban, he's my business, not yours. He's my boy, not yours. I'll take care of him. And notice God didn't say Jacob is a man of integrity. No, he said, just don't say anything good or bad. Just leave him alone. I'll take care of him. He was not to discourage him about what he had done or encourage him to come back. He was just to leave him alone. God had a purpose and plan for Jacob. Now look, Laban was ticked off, and he had... Jacob's got his family, and, he's not in a situation to do much fighting. And so Laban could have, took his daughters back by force, took what he wanted by force, could have killed Jacob and buried him out there in the sand if he wanted to. But God protected Jacob despite his failures because he had a plan for Jacob. It's just like whenever Abraham lied about his wife twice. And Isaac did the same thing. Whenever God intervened in those situations and was merciful and protecting because he had a plan and a purpose. Remember in Genesis 20, whenever God appeared in a dream to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, to warn him not to mess with Abraham's wife? Well, God appeared in a dream to Laban and said, don't mess with Jacob. Verse 26. Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captives, taken with the sword? Come on. That's an exaggeration, isn't it? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and didst not tell me that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, and with tabret, and with harp? Sure. And hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. It's in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight. He said, the God of your father, Laban doesn't know him as his God. He's an idolater. Saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house. And look, I get it, you're homesick. I understand, but I got one question for you. And here's the main concern right here. Yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? So, this conversation between Laban and Jacob is one of heated tempers, false accusations, self-righteous defenses, frustrated narrations, and gross exaggerations. It's quite the conversation. And in trying not to condemn Jacob, Laban made his points against him in the form of questions. God said, don't say anything to him, good or bad. So Laban asked him a bunch of questions to try to condemn him, but be nice about it. And to make him feel guilty, he claimed that had he known they were leaving, he would have given them a going away party. And all he wanted was just the opportunity to kiss his own daughters and grandchildren goodbye. Right? So, obviously, he's just being a manipulator, putting them on a guilt trip. Manipulators like to use guilt trips, I like to tell, when people start that with me, I say, so is there a rest area somewhere along this guilt trip? I'm tired of it already. I've known people like Jacob, man, when it comes to the manipulation, trust me. And so he said, look, Laban said he could understand Jacob being homesick and wanting to go back to his father's house, but he couldn't understand why he would steal his gods. So evidently it didn't dawn on Laban that if his gods could be stolen, they weren't much of a god. Right? Come on. How dumb can you be, right? That's why it says in the Psalms, it talks about the idols are dumb, right? They can't speak. Can't hear. You make them with your own hands. And it says those that make them are like them. Dumb. Paul called it these dumb idols in 1 Corinthians 12. And so, you don't have much of a God if somebody can steal it away. Helpless, right? I'm going to give you this quote from Thomas. He often says, I read through his commentary. It's one of my favorites on Genesis. It's pretty good except where he tries to make Noah's flood local, which is stupid. I don't understand how a guy this smart could have been that dumb on that issue. But he's pretty good on a lot of things. He said this, Laban's attitude of injured innocence is very suggestive in the light of the whole story. It's a mixture of hypocrisy and exaggeration. His expressions of love for his daughters and grandchildren are either utterly unreal or so impulsively emotional as to be practically worthless. He had had many years of opportunity to show love to them, but the very reverse had been their experience as they had told Jacob. Love expressed so late as this cannot be worth much. It is what we are prepared to do for our loved ones while they're with us, not the kind of things we say of them after they're gone. That is the real test and genuine measure of our affection. Hey, people can so easily say, well, I have great love. Well, do the people you claim to love know you love them? Do the people you claim to care about know you care about them? He hadn't shown it all, their whole life. Now all of a sudden he wants to put on this show. And I've often said, like when it comes to a funeral, I think we ought to honor the memory of the person and say a few things, but I'm not about getting up and going on and on about the person, because as far as I'm concerned, we preach our own funeral every day. People know how you lived. And so the main thing to do at a funeral is preach the Word of God. Not preach that person, preach Christ. Say some things, yes, but it gets out of hand a lot of times, and a lot, especially when they're always trying to make the person out better than they really were. They're trying to preach them into heaven, you know. And just how we live is the real issue, not the words we say or the words that are said about us. How we actually live day in and day out. Verse 31. Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid. That's a little bit of honesty there. For I said, peradventure, in other words, supposing thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me, with whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Before our brethren discern what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban saying, why'd you flee the way you did? Jacob said, well, I was afraid. Well, why is he afraid? Didn't God said, I'll be with you? If you go home, I'm going to be with you. So when God makes us a promise, but we're still fearful, it's because we're not believing the promise like we should. Faith cancels out fear, right? He shouldn't have been afraid. He should have trusted God. Just did what God told him to. Just obey God and trust Him with the consequences. But he said, I just figured that when I would leave, you would take your daughters by force and give me, try to prevent me and all this. And so, but as far as the gods, he said, let him not live. Okay, so with one of my servants, he had to think it was one of his servants. If anybody took it, Jacob was against idolatry. He wouldn't have thought one of his wives would want that. He didn't suspect them at all. He said, let him go ahead and kill him. I mean, if he stole your gods, take him out. He wouldn't have thought that it was Rachel. And so he invited Laban to do a search. Verse 33. Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent. First one he went into was Jacob's, because he don't trust Jacob, just like Jacob don't trust him. And Laban went in his tent saying, please let me find it in Jacob's tent. I want to kill him. And Laban went into Jacob's tent, and Leah's tent, into the two maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then he went out of Leah's tent, entered into Rachel's tent. Now, Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture. That didn't mean like there was a dresser on the camel. It just meant like it's the saddle. It was a saddle, but it was a pack saddle. You could put some stuff in it. And so again, these are small images. You can stow them away. And sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tents, but found them not. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the images. Well, he started going through the tent, starting with Jacob and working down. The last one he suspected was Rachel, but she's the one that had him. And because he took his time looking everywhere else, it gave her time to hide the images and come up with some kind of scheme to make sure he wouldn't find them. She's a chip off the old block. And, if you don't know what she meant by what she said, I don't know what to tell you. It's pretty clear, okay? And so the custom of women is upon me. And so verse 36. She's lying. She stole. She's lying. I mean, she has her issues just like Jacob, right? Verse 36. Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. I mean, he scolded him. All right, you accuse me of having your gods and you didn't find them. So why are you making this accusation? And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass and what is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? Whereas thou hast searched all my stuff. I love that. That's a good King James word. That's why I use it all the time. Stuff. Where's my stuff? It said, you've searched all my stuff, and what hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren, thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us. This 20 years have I been with you. You know, he's getting louder as he goes. 20 years I've been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn of beast, I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. He's saying, whether it's my fault or not, I took the loss. Thus I was in the day, the drought consumed me. Oh, and the frost by night. And he's laying it on now, isn't he? And my sleep departed from mine eyes. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and one of them's ugly. No, I just added that in there. That's in the original Hebrew. And 6 years for thy cattle, now hast changed my wages 10 times. He's pretty bitter about that wage change, isn't he? Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac. And I love how he says the fear of Isaac, because we're to fear God. Had been with me, surely thou hast sent me away now empty. God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. Now Jacob is a manipulator because he is a supplanter, he's a schemer, and because he knows God, man, it's bad enough when you have manipulation, but when you get religious with it and people start trying to manipulate you with God, and so he's trying to win this argument. That's what he cares about. He's angry with Laban for pursuing after him like a criminal and making accusations he couldn't prove. And so he's got 20 years of pent-up anger he wants to vent. And he vents it out. He gave a speech. He gave a speech about how great he is. What a great shepherd he had been. And how God vindicated him by rewarding him and rebuking Laban. I'm not quite sure Jacob lived up to what he claimed he had done. I think he's a man that's a legend in his own mind. He's full of pride. He's just trying to make himself look good. He just wants to win the argument. But this thing about Jacob's wages being changed 10 times, that'd be pretty much, if you take it over 20 years, that'd be every 2 years he said, I'm going to change your wages now. I mean, that'd be pretty frustrating and very, inconsistent, not having something you can count on, and it kind of puts you in a upheaval. And it must have been true because Laban never denied it. Now, what I think, my opinion about when he said, you've changed my wages 10 times, I think that means he changed his wages 10 times. Now, that's all one guy said, that's got something to do with the 10 Commandments. Another guy said, come up with all this spiritualizing. It's just, the money he got for his work. And Laban, being the manipulator that he was, he kept messing with it and changing his wages to keep him, on a roller coaster. How would you like it if your salary changed? And it wasn't going up. It was probably going down every time, Just nothing consistent there. All right, verse 43. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle. And all that thou seest is mine. That's what it's all about with Laban right there. But he sees the handwriting on the wall. He's no fool. He's a fool for being an idolater, but he's pretty shrewd. He knows, hey, how am I going to fight against God? What can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto the children which they have borne? He said, I can't come against you, because in doing so I'll be coming against my own family. Not only that, God's on your side, obviously. He said, verse 44, now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. And Jacob took a stone and set it for a pillar. Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made an heap, and they did eat there upon the heap. And Laban called it Jergar-Sahadutha. That's in Aramaic. Jacob called it Galid. That's Hebrew. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Galid. And Mitzpah meaning watchtower, For he said, The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. And he's saying, Jacob, I don't trust you at all. And Laban said to Jacob, Behold this heap, and behold this pillar which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I'll not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount and called his brethren to eat bread. And they did eat bread and tarried all night in the mount. And early in the morning Laban rose up, kissed his sons, his daughters, blessed them. Laban departed, returned unto his place. So Laban claims everything Jacob had was actually his. But, I mean, that's pretty sorry. I mean, Jacob worked. He did. I don't think he was as great as he said he was, but he obviously worked hard for 20 years. And you're going to say everything is actually, I mean, he earned a lot of that. He stole other parts of it. But look, Laban knew he wasn't going to win the battle. God's with Jacob. And besides, he didn't want to come against his daughters and grandchildren. And so he made a covenant. Because he knows, okay, God's going to take care of this guy. I better be on his good side. He's starting to get the hint here. And you see how often people want to make a covenant with Israel. And, of course, later on, under the law of Moses, God forbids Israel from making covenants with the heathen. But Laban the Syrian wants to make this personal covenant that, hey, I'm not going to come after you, and you don't need to come after me. We'll just make a truce here. And so just like he did at Bethel, Jacob set up a stone for a pillar. And then they gathered a heap of stones to be a monument, basically, a testimony to this agreement. A covenant's basically an agreement. And they ate together on top of it. It's always good to seal a deal with a good meal, right? And Laban and Jacob called the heap by two different names, but it meant the same thing in Aramaic and Hebrew. It meant heap of witness. So this is a covenant made between two men that don't trust each other. And they said, look, we need God to referee us. And they wanted God to be a witness between them. And then Jacob offered a sacrifice. The brethren ate together. And Laban got up early the next morning to tell his family goodbye and went on home. And, in these days, the patriarch, the head of the household, was a priest unto God. This was before the Levitical priesthood, obviously. So he offered the sacrifice himself, and he worships God. Now, I'm going to quote one more time from Thomas. He made a good point here on this also. He said, it is impossible to avoid noticing the curious misconception of the term mitzvah, which characterizes its use today as used for a motto on rings, Christmas cards, and even as the title of an organization. It is interpreted to mean union, trust, and fellowship, while its original meaning was that of separation, distrust, and warning. Two men, neither of whom trusted the other, said in effect, I cannot trust you out of my sight. The Lord must be the watchman between us if we and our goods are going to be kept safe from each other. Thus, curiously does primary interpretation differ from spiritual application and conveys a necessary admonition against the misuse of Scripture even by spiritual people. In other words, if people talk about, you'll have like a card about friendship, and it uses the verse in Genesis 31:49, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. But these are not friends here. These are enemies who don't trust each other. And so understand the context. But it happens all the time. People take lines out of the Bible. They'll take a verse out of its context. And a lot of people don't understand biblical interpretation. All they know is application. And if your interpretation is not correct, your application won't be either. You must start with doctrine. What does it mean according to the Scripture? Not your interpretation, God's interpretation. Study the Bible in context and let God teach you His Word. And once you settle that interpretation, then there might be a secondary application. But a lot of people, all they do is try to make application, and when they neglect interpretation, they end up also making the wrong application. So there's something to take note of there. So we'll pick it up next time with Jacob on his way home, and he's going to get in that wrestling match in chapter 32 with the Lord. I wonder who will win that, but we'll talk about that next time.